Hello and welcome. Today's webinar is Land Use and Transportation Policies for a Sustainable Future. My name is Brendan Williams. I am the Research Program Administrator at Portland State University's Transportation, Research, and Education Center. TREC leads the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, one of the national university transportation centers funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. NITC's research priority is improving mobility of people and goods to build strong communities. NITC consortium members are the University of Utah, University of Oregon, University of Arizona, University of Texas at Arlington, and Oregon Institute of Technology. Our presenter today is Dr. Li-Meng Wang, an assistant professor in PSU School of Urban Studies and Planning. He teaches courses in travel demand modeling, transportation and land use, and data analysis methods. His research takes a data-driven approach to address challenging issues in planning, particularly the intersection between land use and transportation. I'll turn it over to him for his presentation in a few minutes. Want to promote our upcoming events. You can always check out our upcoming events through the trec.pdx.edu/events page. We have a Friday transportation seminar coming up on March 5th from 11:30 to 12:30, presented by Roberto Raquejo from Elevated Chicago. He's presenting on forging equity in cities, using ETOD as a blueprint for policy and practice. Our next webinar is March 23rd at 10 a.m. Pacific time. It's be presented by Arthur Nelson, Christina Currens, and Robert Hibbard from the University of Arizona. And it is Transportation Impacts on Jobs, People, and Real Estate. On April 6th at 10 a.m. Pacific time, Mark Schlossberg from the University of Oregon will present on rethinking streets during COVID. Okay, so the presentation will be about 40 minutes long. Then we're gonna have about 15 minutes for your questions. In the GoToWebinar dashboard, there's a section for questions, so please submit them there. During the presentation, we'll have a few minutes at the end also to take your questions. We have a lot of attendees today, so it does behoove you to get them in early. After the webinar, you're going to receive an email with a link to the video recording and presentation slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit, and instructions on how to redeem the credit will be included in the email. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Li-Meng.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
I don't see your screen yet.
Ah, okay.
Oh yes, sorry, I
okay.
do. Here, I'll get out of the way. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Okay, thanks. Again, thanks, Brendan. I am truly inspired. It's truly inspiring to see so many of you showing up for this webinar. And as Brendan introduced, I'm a faculty member at Portland State. Glad, although one correction, I'm glad I got promoted to associate professor a few years back, so that's probably fine. But anyway, the seminar for this morning, I will talk about land use and transportation policy for a sustainable future with autonomous vehicle, with focus on thinking about how we can start planning ahead for a future where AV become autonomous vehicle will become a reality, and especially with some focus on essentially my strength of developing tools to help planners, modelers, the general public to how to essentially better understand the impact of autonomous vehicle and how we can essentially design policies to hopefully promote the benefits and mitigate all the adverse effects. Okay, and then this is in collaborative work with Dr. Yaojian Wu at University of Arizona. I will acknowledge his contribution here. A quick outline. I'll talk about hopefully begin with why should we care about AV, which, as some of you, probably most of you, have aware that we have been talking about it pretty much forever, but it's always 5 years away. Should we care? Should we care about it at all? Especially when we think about how to plan our transportation and transportation system in our cities and regions. I will review and then essentially critique of the methodology that's been used to study those effects. And then I will focus on one methodology that we choose. It's a system dynamics approach. And then we'll go through 3 scenarios and then its results and implication. Finally, I will conclude with some conclusion remarks and then some future and ongoing work that we are doing on this topic. Okay. AVs, I believe many of you have seen this classification. That's 5 or 6 levels of automation for autonomous vehicle, according to the Society for Automobile Engineers. There are 5 levels of the automation. Of course, 0 is no automation at all, and then they gradually increase, and then I will probably, at least I think, we don't need to go in very detail of what's the difference between each of those, but largely what autopilot in a Tesla car is kind of in level 3, where that or maybe level 2 getting to level 3, and Waymo is probably level 3 and get into a level 4. Okay, we don't have any level 5 where there's no driver needed for a vehicle. It can drive itself in all conditions. Okay, we don't have any of those systems yet. Okay, but there is only a lot of talk about that system become available. One example being the Guardian prediction in 2015. I don't want to single out the Guardian because this is a very typical view at that time. Probably it's only dampened a bit nowadays. We probably become a bit less optimistic than when we were in 2015. That the prediction is that in 5 years' time, by last year, that we will essentially have, by the description, will have a level 5 system, and then drivers will become backseat drivers. But of course, that doesn't materialize. And of course, there are now car makers and makers of such system will still predict that the full level 5 or level 4, level 5 system become available in, again, 5 years time, 2025. So it look like that's kind of a perpetual cycle there. So in that case, is it just a fad that we just ignore because that's certainly there are some element of that, or it's something that we should actually start as planners, as even the general public should start to think about those right now? my argument will be, I believe many of those make a similar argument, that it is a transformative technology, that it is making progress continuously, and it's transformative in that many of the impact, if again we have the level 5 system fully deployed, it will have a substantial impact, substantial immediate impact on many of the travels people are making. The first immediate impact will be the costs, monetary cost of driving. This is a summary by Todd Littman that just came out last year, that compared to human driver, that kind of compare a list of current available system that share autonomous vehicle in terms of the per mile, total per mile cost, including all the kind of ownership and so on. Of course, those will be owned by supposedly a fleet company. It will be comparable to public transit. It's only a little bit higher than a human drive car. Okay, so the total cost will be very attractive in terms of the again cost bear by the driver or rider of a AV. And what's even more pronounced is the variable cost. Okay, for private AV, the estimation is that the variable costs, those are the costs that a driver or a rider will pay per mile basis without actually having to essentially separate out the ownership cost or the maintenance probably is appropriate to per mile basis. But in that estimate, that it will be lower than the current automobile variable cost. Okay, current automobile cost will be estimated to be about 20 cents per mile, and it will be, I think it's probably a little bit higher than half, but certainly will have a huge impact in that, because if it's private owned AV and the driver or the rider, depends on how you call that, user of a private AV, it will only pay a tiny amount, less than 20 cents per mile when he or she is using the AV. Right, so that will be a huge incentives when a individual, a household owned autonomous vehicle, it will encourage them to use more and more because the variable cost is so low. Okay, so that's one aspect. The second aspect is so-called value of time. For those of you that are not familiar with the concept, it's basically how much travelers value their time in a vehicle or throughout the trip, right? So the higher a traveler value the time, we want that trip, that travel to be shorter, right? So if I place a higher value of time on driving, then I want my driving trip to be as shorter as possible. On the other hand, if it's lower, then I don't care so much about the time I spend on driving, then I will potentially driving longer. Okay, of course, since we don't have any AV yet, we cannot observe, we cannot actually estimate what the true value of time will be for, again, rider or driver of a user of AV. But we can use experiment to essentially, hopefully approximate what those numbers will be, and use that to inform our study of the effects of AV. All right, this could potentially have a huge impact in that if people care there based on the rationale that people can do, can work, can sleep, can even exercise in AV because they don't need to worry about driving, that the value of time could be substantially lower. But of course, there are some other authors, some other researchers argue the other way, right? That probably on a car, even with AV, that it's potentially that the acceleration, slowdown on a highway may actually make it unrealistic to actually work or doing productive work. So there are arguments either way, as you will find that pretty much in all aspects on the effects of AV, that is the case. But here, of course, has a large range of that impact will be. Some study assumed so-called 100% of car driver value of time, means that the value of time will be exactly the same as a driver nowadays. Okay, to the extreme of, say, essentially zero value of time. People don't care about time at all in the AV at all. They can essentially travel indefinitely in the car. Okay, of course, that the zero value of time essentially, I believe, mostly used as a sensitivity or diagnostics device, not the true value. But another very commonly used value or quantity for value of time estimate will be the high quality rail value of time. On a rail car, people can read, can listen to music, can even work, right? So that may be, if we do have a very good quality of kind of ride for AV, that might be a reasonable assumption there. But again, it could have substantial impact in the on value of time. And then the estimate is essentially all over the place. Okay, and then there are again a wide range of estimate on the benefit on crash reduction, because again many of the crashes nowadays are due to human error. That I believe by one estimate, it's up to 90% of the crashes nowadays on highway are due to human error. If we can kind of probably not totally eliminate those, but at least kind of have a substantial reduction to those numbers, it will have a substantial impact on both kind of the loss due to those crashes, as well as the performance of the our highway or freeway system, due to the delay, due to the reduction in the delay caused by those crashes. And a related, somewhat related concept or impact is the highway capacity, that partially due to the crash reduction, partly due to that AV can travel closer to each other and platooning potentially, and that can expand freeway and highway capacity. That again, there is a wide range of estimate reported in the literature of what the impact, what the magnitude of this impact will be. Another immediate impact will be the parking demand. That because especially when we have a level 5 with us, whenever that is, it will eliminate many of the parking demand, no matter what especially in the downtown or those high priced area of a city or a region. Because for one, if it's a shared autonomous vehicle, that the vehicle will go to pick up other riders. If it's private owned AV, then the owner will probably just send the car to park in a cheaper place, or even send the vehicle home, and so on. So that the demand, parking demand, will have a, you can imagine, potentially a large substantial impact in that. Again, different authors have a different estimate on that aspect. Okay, up to maybe kind of think a so-called elasticity about 90% to maybe down to 30, a bit below 30%. Okay, of course this is incomplete, but I think captures the larger buckets of the immediate impact. One thing I omit here is the potential benefit to people that cannot drive, especially in a region without a good and functioning transit system, right? So those people, those travelers now are able to travel, use whichever format of AV, right? There are at least 2 reviews that I think largely based on my just review on, is one on Todd Lederman, published recently. The other is a 2019 review in the Transport Review. So if that's something you're interested in, I encourage you to check them out. So those immediate impact, of course, will translate into something that can be a utopia or dystopia future, depends on how we essentially regulate those usage, right? So on one end, because of the lower cost, lower value of time, and encouraging long distance travel, if we have a substantial reduction in value of time, that AV could substantially increase VMT. On the other hand, that there are opportunities to even maybe maintain or even reduce VMT by enabling more car sharing, ride sharing, improving access to transit, eliminate the fixed cost of ownership, that if it's a shared autonomous vehicle, people are paying per trip basis, so the costs are more transparent to the user. So they may be more aware of the cost of traveling. And then finally, reclaiming the parking space depends on how we utilize those space. That could potentially kind of create opportunities for inner city to essentially bring people to those to live or work in those space, reclaimed parking space. Okay, another factor there is how soon we will adopt AV if it become available, right? So for those of us that in the planning field, we certainly are familiar with the difficulty of adapting a policy or regulation when there is entrenched behavior, right? So it will likely happen again if we cannot preemptively or proactively put place and regulation in place. And then when the adoption of AV actually start to gain a huge or gain traction, have a substantial market penetration or market share, it become harder to put policies, ideal policies and regulation in place. So there are at least 2, there's certainly more that I probably haven't found, to research and aware of, use different approach to study the trajectory for AV adoption. The first is based on a kind of historically how we adopt different transportation technology by Lavasani and their co-author, that when the technology become available in about 15 years, it will get a market share of about a bit lower than 40%. and then in 20 years, it will gain about 70% market share. Okay. And that, of course, in this case, it's assumed it's become available in 2025. Of course, if that's not the case, we'll probably need to kind of shift that access by however many years. And another paper by, I will not even try to pronounce the author's last name, but by a group of authors in Netherlands, TU Delft, that they use a system dynamic approach and then use the theory of diffusion of innovation, trying to model the market share for different level of automation of vehicles of different level of automation. And then I believe their conclusion will be similar. Of course, they have different scenarios that will change that adoption or market share by some, but eventually it will just change the shape a bit. So again, it will have a similar, probably in this case, it will be in, I think, 15 or 20 years of time, will gain a market share up to 40%. Okay, but that the shape of that trajectory is certainly very similar in that it will have a much steeper adaptation trajectory after the slow uptake in the beginning. Okay, so that gets to a challenge for planners or planning for AV, in that there is huge amount of uncertainty. We don't even know whether it will actually work or not. But on the other hand, given that it will likely be adopted rather quickly, and then given that in all MPOs are mandated with a regional transportation planning time horizon of 20 years, we do need to start to think about or even take AV technology into consideration right now. Okay, at least, but in reality, many of MPOs are, or pretty much all MPOs are ill prepared in this regard, based on one survey by Eric Guerra in 2016. Of course, now it's a bit dated, given how fast things are moving. But at least at that time, essentially, so in his survey, there is there is only one MPO even mentioned AV or driverless automated or autonomous vehicle in their most recent RTP. I believe things has changed, as at least I am aware of. For example, City of Portland does include, or as mentioned, have a placeholder for AV policy that needs to help serve the comprehensive plan for the city, and other cities actually have a similar phrase or wording, at least in their planning documents. Okay, even though we don't know much, but we do have a placeholder for those. So that's certainly an encouraging sign. On the other hand, kind of as I believe I already kind of mentioned, a wait and see approach may not actually be optimal, especially given the trajectory of the adoption. That if we do wants to promote a more sustainable usage of EV, and we do need to kind of start thinking now and then trying to put those policies and regulation in place right when EV start to rolling off. That's the easiest place to implement them. Okay, so how do we anticipate? How do we essentially do research and then anticipate the impact of EV, and then help design policy that can help promote a sustainable future, as I advertise in my slides. So in terms of methods that they are arranged, there are of course different classification. In a larger category, those are the summary by Hall and his co-author, that are largely four larger categories. A narrative approach, largely used by journalists that trying to come up with a narrative of how the technology will evolve, how it will change the behavior of individuals and so on. And the second approach will be analyzing historical data for the adoption process. That's the example Lavisani that I just mentioned, that use historical data trying to study how other technology, transportation technology has been adopted, and then use that to use that to infer how AV technology will be adopted in the future. Okay, and then the third method is collecting questionnaire surveys of either experts, planners, and users, and then collect their opinion or their kind of reaction to the AV technology. Okay, for users, what one is particularly interesting is the so-called stated preference experiments. They essentially ask or create a hypothetical scenario where a user survey participants are presented with choices where there are a AV option with a certain set of attributes, costs, comfort level, or waiting time, shared or not, and so on. And then that can be used to gain some insight of how users will respond to AV when it becomes available. But on the other hand, how reliable those experiments will be, because nobody, or very few people, I think some lucky people maybe in Arizona has tried them on a Waymo, and maybe some other users, but most people will have never experienced AV, and then how much they will kind of be able to perceive the hypothetical scenario present to them will be certainly questionable. Finally, will be a simulation approach, trying to quantify the effects of AV that to a microscopic level will be trying to study how kind of the flow of autonomous vehicle, or trying to study how much vehicle, or the size of fleet, how much autonomous vehicle will be needed to serve a certain area if all trips are on a shared autonomous vehicle. That's an example of the work by Fagnant and Kochman. And I believe those are, of course, I believe there must be more, but at least those four large categories capture the most of the research out there. In terms of specifically in the transportation, specific method in the transportation planning and modeling field, the NCHRP report, research report 892 does cataloged the actually common used approach by transportation planners and modelers to study or to capture the effects of AV. The first, of course, is the familiar travel demand model, either a trip-based or a activity-based travel demand model that essentially being adapted to study the effects of AV. I believe many of you may be familiar with how to use travel demand model, but in this case, because we don't have, again, observed data to allow us to estimate the parameters in those modules, in those submodels for travel demand model, we will have to essentially use tricks, use hacks to trick those systems, to trace those systems to essentially simulate, to estimate the impact of AV. One example is showing here is work by done by Chavez and her colleague at PSRC Puget Sound Region Council, that they essentially create 4 scenarios, or of course, in addition to a baseline scenario where there's no AV. That in scenario 1, they assume that AV will expand the freeway capacity by 30, freeway and arterial capacity by 30%. Scenario 2, where the value of time would decrease by 35%. And then scenario 3 will be 50% reduction in parking cost. And scenario 4 is essentially a policy scenario that enforces a pricing strategy, of pricing regulation that push the price for autonomous vehicle trips to $1.65. That is a very radical policy. As you recall, that some of the estimate for the travel cost for EV is only below 50 cents per mile, including both the fixed and variable costs. Okay, so that's essentially more than triple that cost there. So no surprise that in scenario 1, 2, and 3, that the VMT, vehicle mile travels, increased from 33.6 to close to 20%. Okay, VHT increased in a similar amount, slightly smaller, but similar amount, especially for scenario 3. Scenario 1 and 2, based on because of that assumption, because of the expand capacity that hasn't been fully saturated yet, it does have a decline in or decrease in VHT. It means a decrease in congestion overall. And in scenario 4, the radical policy scenario, that the VMT actually would decline substantially up to 35%, and the VHT declined by 41%. Of course, that's again rather radical. It would be great if we can achieve something like that. Okay, that's again a typical application of applying TDM, travel demand model, to study the impact of AV. We have to make assumptions on what the impact will be, and then implement those hacks in the current travel demand model. But the downside is, given that it's a model, it has many parameters in those models, and then we may not be able to fully capture the feedbacks between those different impacts, as well as the interactions of those impacts. Okay, and then there are 2 largely in the category of strategic planning. One is vision eval. That's also being applied to study the impact of AV. Brian Greger, the original creator of the predecessor of vision eval, applies a version of vision eval to study the impact of AV for Atlanta Regional Commission. It certainly has it cover a very nice niche in that it's simplified from both the travel demand model as well as some other more land use model component, for example. But it doesn't have a fully, at least as of now, it doesn't have a fully functional land use model. It's a very simplified land use model that allocates activities to different area types. So it may not fully capture the potential feedback loop between the lower travel cost and relocating of population. Okay, so in that case, may not be able to fully evaluate the longer term impact when especially taking into consideration the land use aspects. Another creation of Brian Greger is a Fosse Cognitive Map that my understanding is essentially a simplified version of a system dynamic approach, trying to adapt a easy to use approach to study the impact of different policies. In this case, emerging transportation technology. Okay, they did actually apply the method to study the impact of AV along other technologies. But here, for one, it doesn't fully capture again all the feedbacks among those different impacts. The other, it doesn't have a time dimension. It doesn't fully capture how that impact will evolve. It seems to be a one-off impact that once you have AV, you will end up with this. Okay. And then there are two that's, I think, while rather commonly used approach to study effects of ABM, activity-based, agent-based model, and system dynamic. It both has its pro and con. One is bottom-up. ABM is bottom-up. It models the behavior of individual agents. And then system dynamic, on the other hand, is top-down. You're trying to study or trying to capture at the system and the macro level how different variable, different phenomena interact with each other, and then how those will create feedback loops and then kind of create the larger impact over time. Okay, so I'm aware of I'm running a bit slower than I expected, so I will probably skip through this. There's both have pro and cons. You can essentially argue either way, but I do agree that that system dynamic can be a valuable tool to study the impact of AV, especially when we do not know much about the micro behavior of individual, how household will respond to AV. But on the other hand, we do have some understanding at a macro level how we increase capacity will expand, will increase the travel time. On the other hand, increase volume would increase the travel time, and then increase or expand the region will of course bring more travel to the region. So this is the approach we adopt, and then we build our base scenario based on a Sturman model of congestion. Sturman is one of the kind of leading researcher in system dynamics. That this is an example that include in his textbook, essentially business dynamics. And our scenario, apologize that the font is really small. I tried to zoom, but it won't cover to, I won't be able to put it on the screen. But this is a model that adapted by Gruhl and Stanford in his paper, that how in a system dynamic diagram called causal loop diagram, how use of AV will affect different aspects of the transportation system through travel behavior, and then through the change to highway capacity, the size of a region, and attractiveness of car traveling, and so on. So, and in their case, they actually they develop the scenario, and then they largely use this as a way to reason about how the impact would be. They never actually do any simulation based on this. I believe for probably good reason. It's a pretty complex model, and then many of those quantities is unknown. Okay, but what our work is trying to implement this as a actual simulation model of system dynamics. Okay, we trying to build on the knowledge that we have in through the literature of what each of those impact, especially those immediate impact, will be, and then how for example, use of AV will affect the highway capacity, for example, and how it will affect the safety of vehicle operation, and then use that to build a simulation model. Okay, and oh, actually, I realize I'm using the mouse on the wrong screen. I hope I tried to point something, but apparently now we will be able to see that. Sorry about that. But and we have at this point we simulate 3 scenarios in addition to a baseline scenario. Scenario 1 is we have AV, but there is no behavior change. Of course, that is unlikely, but it's good exercise to go through. Scenario 2 is private-owned AV with behavior change, including relocation or to fringe of the region. Scenario 3 is a shared AV. Okay, I do have to rush out a bit. So the results is in that the lower monetary cost and value of time leads to increase in VMT in all three scenarios, and the region increase in size in scenario 2 and 3 when households take advantage of lower travel cost and longer acceptable travel time. And then finally, the benefit of increased capacity and safety from AV adoption is only decreased. Maybe, again, depends on different assumption that could actually be fully absorbed due to induced travel demand. And then that simulation, I think, do have some implications for planning in that pricing will be probably the most effective policy, not only from our simulation, but also on previous work. Of course, not only the one, but certainly including Chilray's work demonstrating that when we put in the right, or actually sometimes maybe radical price for trips, that we could bring down the VMT, VHT, okay? And then if we can devise a pricing strategy that we incentivize share rides, disincentivize zero and single passenger AV trips, that could actually be certainly helpful. And land use policies certainly have potential to contain regions from sprawling, but it does have the tricky issue in that here, for example, in Portland, if our region wants to, this metro region wants to still stick to urban growth boundary or even strengthen it, people could essentially easily move to Vancouver or elsewhere that doesn't have such a stringent urban growth boundaries, even especially when people can accept essentially sleep or work or do other things on AV. So that's something that's only that's a new challenge, and we could there are rooms to design policies to encourage coordination of shared autonomous vehicle and transit, but that's certainly a huge area that needs to look into. And I will probably just briefly mention again, this huge amount of uncertainty. And then that is also some of the work that we're trying to continue to do, trying to using other tools to help us better understanding the uncertainty in the model. And then eventually we hope to provide this model and code as a tool that anyone can use to better understanding the effects of AV, and then help looking into how different policies may or may not make a difference. Sorry to have to rush through. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the financial support for the project from NITC, our community partner, Oregon Metro and PAC, and then our group of graduate research assistants. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Li Ming. All right, so we have a few questions, but I think we'll have time to handle a few more. So
Okay.
if you have anything, please submit it now. I'm going to go sort of in the order of your presentation with this first question. And so in the beginning of the presentation, you talked about, well, you showed the Guardian article, which isn't the only example of the expectations of AV before, it's happening. And so personally, I assume it'll happen soon. What can you say about why it's going to take a little bit longer? What's causing the delay?
Right. Actually, that's pretty common. I think pretty much we as a human being, we do have the tendency to be overly optimistic at the beginning. I should probably include I think the what's the name of the trajectory? It's certainly we have kind of over exuberance or over optimistic or have a peak optimism in the beginning, and then we crash down from there, and then gradually picking up in the in our kind of expectation of the AV adoption. I think it's a similar situation here. We certainly when a new things, especially a transformative technology like AV comes up, everyone gets so excited. Especially those car makers and system makers, this only has incentives to trying to keep the excitement on, and then trying to promote those systems by probably over promising, at least in the timeline for those systems. So I think we certainly, that optimism certainly dampened a bit in at least currently, but still I believe at least from what I see, there's still estimate about maybe 5 to 10 years we do have some wider availability of the system. Only time can tell whether that again is a empty promise, empty expectation here. But I do think those systems are making progress. So Waymo has been has been testing fully autonomous ride in Arizona, I believe the Phoenix region. That I believe many people actually they are way over subscribed. Many people do want to try it on. From what I heard from those people that do take a ride on those, it seems to be working pretty well without actually they don't have a backup driver on those car. A passenger get on those car by themselves, and then will be able to drive to the destination. So it's only pretty cool. It seems to making huge progress on those systems. Of course, it will have setback from time to time, and then but again, what I'm trying to say is it will sooner or later we will probably get there, and then once we achieve that point, we will actually based on what we know, we will have a rather rapid adaptation from there.
So I imagine there's not too much like policy people taking the wait and see approach, and I think consumers, a lot of them are looking ahead, thinking like this is going to be great. It's going to be safer. I'm going to be able to do other things. Um, there's a question on though how we would mitigate the impacts, the negative impacts, effects of the individually and privately owned vehicles,
Mm.
specifically what governments can do. You gave the
Mhm.
example of that higher cost per trip, but then that showed that that really decreased the numbers. So probably that's not going to be an option.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. Of course, as I mentioned, that is only a radical policy unless we have other policies in place, especially with, say, provision of transit system. I don't think it's feasible to actually to sort of jack up the price as high as that. But I do think this is an area require very careful thought on a pricing policies. For one, given the benefit, we do want to encourage the usage, adoption and usage of autonomous vehicle. On the other, especially over longer term, we do want to find a balance of the kind of utilize the benefit from those systems, but on the other hand, we don't want to let the essentially VMT run away, VMT VHT, the delay, run away, as well as the sprawling pattern that will entrench those VMT, those long distance travel in our system, right? So from essentially lesson learned over however many decades we have since we have all the free highway system, that once we have the system with us, it's very hard to make a change, especially when we have land use sprawling land use pattern here. People do have to travel to where they work to get what they need for their life. It will be very difficult to increase the cost of travel because it will become a burden, especially for those lower income households, right? So that's where we do think maybe we could have some user fees for the AV, but that may, on top of that, trying to add on some redistributional policies that provides coupons, subsidies to lower income households. Maybe that might be a combination that could work.
Sounds good. So we have, people here that are not just from Portland, they're from other places as well. But you did mention that dynamic between Portland and Vancouver, Washington. I can think of living in Vancouver, Washington, and working in Portland. One of the major issues is that transportation. So
Yeah.
if people enjoyed it more, maybe more people then, or it didn't bother them at least, more people might live outside of Portland.
Mhm.
Um, not to just focus on Portland if there's another place you know about, but what kind of impact or can that have on cities that are trying to have transit supportive, mixed use, affordable
Mhm.
towns
Mhm.
type areas? I imagine residents leaving is
Mhm.
certainly not the vibrant goal that they want.
Right. Yeah, that actually is a very good question, for which I don't have a good answer. I do hope towards like what we are developing do actually provide at least a little bit of help in think at least to think through this. Of course, the dynamic will be or at least rather complex, in that for one, kind of within a region boundary could expand, especially if many of the impact of AV materialize, especially the impact on value of time. That it will solely leads to essentially the expansion, at least the so-called commuting shed area, the area that people commuting to and from, and that I believe is will happen, especially if we will not be able to coordinate the land use policy across different jurisdiction boundaries. All right, Vancouver and Portland being a case in point here. But even if we can, I believe there will still people that due to their preference for lifestyle, they want to live in rural area. I believe those will and could happen. The question there is what is the magnitude in those cases, right? And on the other hand, it does provide some opportunities, especially due to longer term, due to the reclaiming of parking space that open up capacities, land for redevelopment to create a lifestyle that actually may cater to many people that's now do want to live in inner city or close-in communities, but they just cannot afford to live in those places. But if we do have new capacity bring on and then bring the cost down with the amenity of living in inner city, I do think it may attract many households to actually move in or live closer to CBD area. That actually can be an opportunity in kind of land use policy there. So it's very dynamic. It's with many feedback loops, and then I do think policy in this case could make a huge difference.
Great. All right. So we do have one more question about the infrastructure. How you think the infrastructure for these vehicles should be developed as technology upgrades become quicker? Are there some issues with technology and infrastructure?
Right, infrastructure, right. This is something I have paid spatial attention. They are in terms of the infrastructure technology. I think it's probably, if I understand it correctly, the problem is probably in the adoption of AV, how we can prepare those infrastructure for the technology. This is probably an area I paid less attention given my background as a planner. I tend to think more on the planning and policy as well as the behavior aspects. But there, at least in the intermediate, in the process of AV adoption, there are many speculation that we may actually need to customize or actually to prepare our transportation infrastructure and other for AV. For example, we may have to prepare or to set those signal system, traffic signals, and so on, so that AV can actually utilize those information and reduce or essentially facilitate the adoption of AV. And then, of course, a huge piece will be parking or pick up or drop off if we have a shared autonomous vehicle. And then how we think and design parking in the area of AV. I think I could probably parking, I suppose, can think of as part of infrastructure. And then there is, of course, the infrastructure for communication or ITC technology that will certainly have a huge demand for those as well, given the amount of data that needs to communicate for AV. but again, that's only, I think it's only a huge area that worth a lot of attention, but it's a bit beyond my current area of expertise.
All right, well, we can wrap up now. Li-Ming, do you have anything else you'd like to add, or?
No, that's all. Thank you all for coming and stick with the seminar. I do hope that will be informative. I saw that Brendan posted a link to the project website. I apologize, my project report has been delayed for various reasons. But we will post the final report to that link, and I will provide a link in the report to the project or to the code base for the model and the code that you need to run those models. Okay, so maybe check back in. Believe we will send out notification when the report or weekly or monthly track or NITC email that will announce that a new report our new report will become available. So check back them. Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, follow along for our upcoming events. And as Li-Ming is mentioning, the newsletters will tell you about new research that's coming out and other notable accomplishments and ongoing. So thank you and have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.